I never thought I'd be the mother who wasn't invited to her own daughter's wedding. The morning I found out, I was arranging peonies in the crystal vase that had belonged to my grandmother, white peonies for new beginnings. I'd always told myself, 26 years of motherhood, countless school plays and scraped knees, and midnight conversations about boys. All of it suddenly meant nothing when my neighbour casually mentioned seeing Briony's engagement announcement in the Portland paper. "Such a lovely photo," she said, her voice careful. "I'm sure you're thrilled about the June wedding, but what happens when your own child decides you don't deserve a place at the table you spent decades setting?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The peonies were still fresh when I called Briony 3 days later. I'd spent those 72 hours in a strange liminal space, moving through my cottage like a ghost haunting her own life. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains I'd hung when I first moved to Camden 5 years ago. After the divorce, after the slow unraveling of everything I thought I knew about family. My hand shook as I dialed a number, the same number I'd been calling for 15 years, through college and graduate school, and her first apartment in Boston. The phone rang once, twice, and I found myself gripping the antique pearl earrings my mother had given me on my wedding day. I'd planned to give them to Briony for her wedding, a continuation of a tradition that stretched back 3 generations, of women who believed in love enough to keep trying. "Hello, Mom." Her voice was careful, measured. She knew why I was calling. "Briony." I took a breath, tasting salt air from the open window. I saw the announcement, the silence stretched between US like the 13 miles of rocky coastline that separated my cottage from her apartment in Rockland. I could picture her in that minimalist space she'd created, everything white and clean and deliberately empty of the colourful chaos that had defined her childhood in my gallery. "I meant to call you," she said finally. "When?" "After the honeymoon." "Mum, please don't make this harder than it has to be." I looked out at Penobscot Bay, where lobster boats were heading out for their morning hauls. These fishermen had been working these waters for generations, their fathers and grandfathers before them. There was something to be said for tradition, for the idea that some things endured simply because they mattered. "I don't understand," I said. "Help me understand." Another pause. In the background, I could hear the familiar sounds of her world, the coffee grinder, and Pia murmuring about international news, the efficient morning routine of a woman who'd built her life around control and careful planning. "It's going to be very small," she said. "Just immediate family." The words hit me like cold water. Immediate family. As if 26 years of motherhood could be erased by marriage. As if I'd somehow become extended, optional, easily left behind. "I see." I fingered the pearl earrings. "And immediate family includes Clary, I suppose?" I heard her sharp intake of breath. Clary, her stepmother of 8 years, the woman who'd married Briony's father 6 months after our divorce was finalized. The woman who'd somehow convinced my daughter that I was the source of all family drama, that peace could only be achieved through my careful exclusion. "This isn't about Clary, isn't it?" "Mom, you and I both know that family gatherings are complicated when you're involved, complicated." As if my presence alone was enough to disrupt the careful choreography of their new family dynamic. As if I hadn't spent years biting my tongue at graduations and birthday parties, watching Clary rewrite the narrative of Briony's childhood, positioning herself as the stable maternal figure, while I became the flighty artist who'd chosen creativity over conventional motherhood. "I've never caused a scene," I said quietly. "You don't have to cause a scene to make people uncomfortable." The accusation hung in the air. I thought about all the ways I'd apparently failed by encouraging Briony's artistic interest when her father wanted her to be practical, by taking her to galleries and poetry readings instead of country club events, by modeling a life that valued authenticity over appearance. Who else isn't invited? I asked. What do you mean? I mean, if we're talking about people who make others uncomfortable, I'm curious about the guest list. Is your father's brother coming? The one who gets drunk at every family event. What about? Cousin Sarah, who always brings up politics. Or is it just me who's too complicated for your special day? This is exactly what I'm talking about, Briony said, her voice rising slightly. You make everything about you. I closed my eyes. Outside, I could hear the sound of waves against the rocks, the eternal rhythm that had been comforting me for 5 years. When I'd moved to this cottage, I thought I was creating a refuge, a place where Briony could visit and we could rebuild what had been damaged by the divorce. Instead, I'd apparently isolated myself even further. I love you, I said simply. I just want to celebrate your happiness. I know you do. But this is what's best for everyone except me. I thought, but didn't say. I'd learned, through years of trying to maintain a relationship with my daughter, that certain truths were better left unspoken. The art of loving someone who didn't quite love you back was all about knowing when to push and when to retreat. When is the wedding? I asked. June 15th, 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to process the fact that I would spend what should have been one of the most important days of my life as a complete outsider to my daughter's joy. Where? The Montgrove estate. You know, the one on Highland Road. I knew it well. I'd driven past it countless times, admiring the sprawling Victorian mansion that sat on 20 acres overlooking the bay. It was exactly the kind of venue Briony would choose, all elegant, expensive, and exclusive. The kind of place that required advance booking and substantial deposits, which meant this decision to exclude me hadn't been last minute. It had been planned, deliberate, carefully orchestrated. It's beautiful there, I said, double quotes yes. It is. We sat in silence for a moment, and I found myself memorizing the sound of her breathing. When had we become strangers? When had the little girl, who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, become this careful, distant woman who weighed every word before speaking? I should go, she said finally. I have a client meeting. Of course she did. Briony ran her own event planning business now, specializing in high-end weddings and corporate retreats. She was successful, independent, everything I'd raised her to be. Except she'd also become someone who could plan the most important day of her life without including the woman who'd given her life. Briony, I said before she could hang up. I hope it's everything you've dreamed of. Thank you, she said softly. And for just a moment, I heard the little girl she used to be. After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, holding the pearl earrings and watching the morning light move across the walls. The cottage felt smaller somehow, as if the conversation had physically diminished the space I occupied in the world. I'd moved here after the divorce with such hope. The cottage was perfect, a renovated sea captain's house with wide pine floors and windows that captured every angle of light. I'd set up a small studio in the sunroom where I could paint, and I'd imagined lazy weekends with Briony, teaching her to see the way light played on water, sharing the artistic eye that had always been our connection. Instead, she'd visited exactly 3 times in 5 years. Each visit was shorter than the last, and each one ended with some version of the same conversation about how I needed to move on and build a life that didn't revolve around her. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent her childhood encouraging her independence, teaching her to be strong and self-sufficient. I'd succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. She was so independent that she no longer needed a mother at all. I walked through the cottage, looking at it with fresh eyes. Every room told the story of a woman trying to build something beautiful from the wreckage of her former life. The living room with its carefully curated mix of antiques and modern art. The kitchen with its collection of ceramic bowls and copper pots, ready to feed people who rarely came. The guest bedroom that stayed perpetually ready for a daughter who had stopped visiting Dot in my studio. Canvases line the walls as seascapes mostly, but also portraits of Briony at various ages, painted from memory and photographs. There was 5-year-old Briony building sandcastles, 10-year-old Briony reading in the garden, 16-year-old Briony in her prom dress, radiant and hopeful. I'd painted her at 21, graduating from college, and at 25, getting her first apartment, but I realized I had no recent paintings. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being able to see her clearly enough to capture her on canvas. The phone rang, startling me out of my reverie. I glanced at the caller ID and saw my best friend Iris's name. I just talked to my mother, Iris said without preamble. She heard from Mrs. Henderson, who heard from her daughter-in-law, who works at the flower shop. Is it true that Briony's getting married and you're not invited? Trust Iris to cut straight to the heart of things. We'd been friends for 25 years, ever since she'd walked into my gallery in Boston looking for art to decorate her first apartment. She was a fashion designer now, living in Paris half the year, but she'd never lost her ability to see through social niceties to the truth underneath. It's true, I said. That little ... double quotes. Iris stopped herself. I'm sorry, honey. I know she's your daughter, but that's unconscionable. She says it's complicated. Complicated my ass. You're her mother. You carried her for 9 months, raised her for 18 years, and supported her through college. How complicated could it be to add one more place setting? I appreciated Iris's outrage on my behalf, but it also highlighted how alone I felt in this situation. Everyone who heard the story was appalled, which only made me feel more isolated in my acceptance of it. Was I weak for not fighting harder? Should I have demanded inclusion, threatened to cause the very scene Briony was trying to avoid? I don't know what to do, I admitted. Do you want my honest opinion? Always. Show up anyway. I laughed despite myself. Right. Crash my daughter's wedding. That'll show her I'm not the kind of person who causes drama. I'm serious, Celeste, not to crash it, but to be there. Rent a room at that fancy inn down the road. Take yourself to dinner. Show the world that you won't be erased. And accomplish what exactly? Accomplish nothing. That's not the point. The point is to refuse to disappear just because someone decided. You don't matter. After Iris hung up, her words echoed in my mind. Refuse to disappear. It was such a simple concept, but it felt revolutionary. For 5 years, I'd been making myself smaller, taking up less space, being less inconvenient. I'd accepted the divorce settlement that left me with a fraction of what I'd contributed to our marriage. I'd moved away from Boston and the gallery I'd built, making it easier for Richard and Clary to construct their new life. I'd bit my tongue at family gatherings and smiled through Christmas dinners where I was clearly an unwelcome guest. I'd been so focused on being the kind of mother who didn't burden her adult daughter that I'd forgotten how to be the kind of woman who didn't burden herself. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my back porch, watching the sunset paint the bay in shades of pink and gold. The Montgrove estate was visible in the distance, its windows catching the last light of the day. In 3 weeks, it would be full of people celebrating my daughter's new beginning. Music and laughter and dancing, toast to the happy couple, all the joy and ritual that mark the most important passages of our lives. And I would be where, sitting in this same spot, pretending I was fine with being forgotten. I thought about the woman I used to be, before the marriage that slowly eroded my sense of self, before the divorce that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about love and family. I'd been bold once, unafraid to take up space in the world. I'd opened a gallery when everyone said it was too risky. I'd featured unknown artists when the safe choice would have been established names. I'd trusted my instincts and built something beautiful and meaningful, When had I become so afraid of inconveniencing people that I'd stopped advocating for myself entirely? I pulled out my phone and looked up the Montgrove Estates website. It was even more beautiful than I'd remembered. Sweeping lawns that rolled down to the water, gardens full of roses and peonies, a wraparound porch that seemed designed for wedding photos. The kind of place where fairy tales came true, at least for the people lucky enough to be invited. But then I noticed something interesting. The estate had multiple properties, the main house where events were held, but also several smaller buildings scattered across the grounds. A carriage house, a guest cottage, and something called the West Wing, which had been converted into a separate residence with its own entrance and gardens. I scrolled through the photos, my heart beating faster. The West Wing was lovely, smaller than the main house but still elegant, with French doors that opened onto a private terrace overlooking the same bay where my daughter would be celebrating. It was close enough to hear the music, far enough away to maintain dignity, before I could talk myself out of it. I clicked on the contact information and dialed the number. Montgrove Estate. "This is Ezra speaking." The voice was warm, cultured, with the hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. "Hello," I said. "I'm wondering about availability for the West Wing on June 15th. Let me check." I heard the sound of pages turning. June 15th, That's the weekend of the Varnon Richardson wedding. Lovely young couple. You wouldn't happen to be family, would you? I paused, unsure how to answer. In a manner of speaking, well, as it happens, the West Wing is available. We don't typically rent it during major events at the main house, but I suppose we could make an exception. Are you looking for accommodations? For the wedding weekend, something like that, I said. I'd like to host a small dinner party. Very intimate, just a few close friends. How lovely. Nothing like a celebration to bring people together. The West Wing has a beautiful dining room and a full kitchen. Would you be interested in catering services? I thought about it. Why not? If I was going to do this, I might as well do it properly. Yes, I said. I think I would. Wonderful. Shall we say Saturday evening? I could prepare something special. I pride myself on creating memorable dining experiences. That would be perfect. We discussed details of deposit, menu options, the logistics of hosting a dinner party for people who didn't yet know they were invited. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation. I wasn't going to disappear. I wasn't going to spend my daughter's wedding day hiding in shame. I was going to be there, 50 yards away, creating my own celebration of love and family and the ties that bind us even when they're stretched to the breaking point. It might not change anything between Briony and me. It might not heal the wounds that had been accumulating for years, but it would prove something to myself that I'd forgotten along the way. I was worth celebrating, even if I had to do it myself. The ceramic teacup shattered against the kitchen floor with a sound that perfectly matched how I felt inside. It was my grandmother's spo, part of a set I'd inherited and treasured for 30 years. The same cups I'd served tea in when Briony was small, when she'd sit at this very table with her feet dangling, telling me about her day at school. I stared at the delicate blue and white fragments scattered across the pine boards, and for the first time since learning about the wedding, I allowed myself to cry. It had been 6 days since my conversation with Briony, and I'd spent them in a strange state of suspended animation. I'd made lists of people to invite to my impromptu dinner party, then thrown them away. I'd started to call Iris back a dozen times, then lost my nerve. I'd even driven past the Montgrove estate twice, trying to imagine myself there, trying to convince myself I wasn't making a terrible mistake. But this morning had broken something in me. This morning, I'd received an envelope with no return address, postmarked from Rockland. Inside was a wedding invitation, not for me, but forwarded by someone who thought I should see it. The heavy card stuck, the elegant calligraphy, the careful wording that managed to mention both sets of parents while somehow making my absence feel intentional rather than cruel, together with their families. Briony and Varnon and Marcus James Richardson request the pleasure of your company. Double quotes there. Families. As if I weren't part of that equation. As if 18 years of motherhood could be written out of existence with careful phrasing and strategic omissions. I knelt among the broken pieces of china, picking them up one by one, and I thought about all the things that had shattered quietly over the years. Not dramatic explosions, but slow fractures that spread until something that had once been whole became irreparable. My marriage had broken that way, small cracks appearing after Briony was born. A Richard's resentment of the attention I gave her, my gradual realization that he saw fatherhood as an interruption rather than a gift, his increasing criticism of my work at the gallery, his suggestion that I was being selfish by pursuing my passion for art when I should be focused on family. The way he'd begun to edit my opinions at dinner parties, smoothing over my sharper edges until I'd learned to stay quiet rather than be corrected. By the time he met Clary at a business conference, our marriage was already fragile enough that her arrival simply provided the excuse he'd been looking for. She was everything I wasn't: a corporate, conventional, agreeable. She thought his jokes were funny and his opinions insightful. She didn't challenge him or complicate his worldview. She made him feel like the man he wanted to be, while I'd apparently made him feel like someone he didn't recognize. But I'd never imagined that losing my husband would eventually mean losing my daughter too. I found a small trash bag and carefully collected the pieces of the teacup, wondering if it could be glued back together or if some things, once broken, were meant to stay that way. The phone rang just as I was sweeping up the last of the fragments. I glanced at the caller ID and saw Richard's name, my ex-husband, calling for the first time in 2 years. "Hello, Richard." "Celeste." His voice carried that careful tone he'd always used when he was about to say something he knew I wouldn't like. "I heard you spoke with Briony." "I did. She's upset." I set down the broom and leaned against the counter. "She's upset. She feels like you're trying to guilt her into changing her mind about the wedding." "I'm not trying to do anything." I asked her to help me understand why I wasn't invited to my own daughter's wedding. "I think that's a reasonable question for a mother to ask, Celeste. You know how difficult these situations can be. Briony just wants everyone to be comfortable, everyone except me, apparently." I'd heard this song before: the careful choreography of family dynamics, where my comfort was always the sacrifice made for everyone else's peace. "And you agree with her decision?" "I think Briony is old enough to make her own choices about her wedding." It was a long answer that managed to sound supportive while avoiding any actual responsibility. Classic Richard, always finding a way to stay above the fray while letting others do the difficult emotional work. "Richard," I said carefully, "do you think I'm a bad mother?" The question surprised us both. In 20 years of marriage and 5 years of careful post-divorce communication, I'd never asked him directly for his opinion of my parenting. "No," he said, and his voice was softer. "No, Celeste, you're not a bad mother. You love Briony deeply. That's never been in question. Then help me understand why loving her deeply isn't enough to earn me a place at her wedding." He was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. "I think," he said finally, "that sometimes love isn't enough if it comes with too much complexity." Complexity. There was that word again, as if my very existence created complications that others were forced to navigate around. What kind of complexity am I creating by wanting to celebrate my daughter's marriage? It's not about what you want, Celeste. It's about what happens when you're in the same room with Clary. The tension affects everyone. I've never said a word against Clary at any family gathering. You don't have to say anything. Your feelings are written all over your face. I closed my eyes, remembering all the birthday parties and graduations where I'd smiled until my cheeks ached. All the times I'd bitten my tongue when Clary made subtle digs about my unconventional lifestyle or my confusing career choices. Apparently, my efforts to maintain peace hadn't been as successful as I'd thought, so the solution is to exclude me entirely. The solution is to accept that Briony is trying to start her marriage without the weight of family drama, as if wanting to maintain a relationship with my daughter was inherently dramatic, as if my presence alone was enough to spoil the celebration. I see, I said quietly. I hope you do. I hope you can find a way to be happy for her from a distance. After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the remnants of my grandmother's teacup and thought about distance. I'd been practicing it for 5 years, the careful space I'd put between myself and my former life, the way I'd learned to love Briony quietly, without expectations or demands. I'd become an expert at loving from a distance, but distance, I was learning, could become a habit. And habits, once established, were hard to break. I thought about the woman I'd been before I learned to make myself smaller, the woman who'd opened a gallery in Boston's competitive art scene and made it successful through sheer determination and good taste. The woman who discovered unknown artists and given them their first shows, who'd fought for pieces she believed in even when others thought they were too risky or unconventionality, and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That woman wouldn't have accepted exclusion gracefully. That woman would have found a way to be present for what mattered, regardless of who found it uncomfortable. I picked up my phone and called the Montgrove estate. Ezra speaking. Hello, this is Celeste Varnon. We spoke about renting the West Wing for June 15th. Yes, Ms. Varnon. Have you decided on final numbers for your dinner party? I looked around my empty kitchen, at the spaces where my grandmother's teacups used to sit, at the invitation that lay on my counter like evidence of my erasure. 8 people, I said, though I had no idea who the other 7 would be. And I'd like to hire a musician as well, someone who can play during dinner. Wonderful. I know just the person, a lovely young violinist who often performs at our events. Very talented, very discreet. Perfect. I paused, gathering courage for what I was about to say. And Ezra, I should mention that my daughter is the bride at the main event that evening. There was a brief silence. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully neutral. I see. And she's aware of your plans. She's aware that I exist, I said. Whether she acknowledges it is up to her. Well, he said after a moment, and I could hear something like approval in his tone. I've always believed that love finds a way to make itself known, regardless of the circumstances. After I hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the thrill of taking a risk. It was terrifying and exhilarating and probably completely foolish, but it was also authentically mine. The first decision I'd made in years that wasn't filtered through what others would think or how others would react. I was going to be there for my daughter's wedding, whether she wanted me there or not. I was going to celebrate her happiness and refuse to be erased from one of the most important days of her life. And if that created complications or discomfort or family drama, so be it. Some things were worth fighting for, even if you had to. Fight quietly, with dignity intact and love as your only weapon. I walked to my studio and pulled out a fresh canvas. For the first time in months, I knew exactly what I wanted to paint. A woman standing in a garden, surrounded by broken pieces, but still whole, still standing, still claiming her place in the world. The painting could wait until after the wedding. Right now, I had a dinner party to plan and a statement to make. I had a daughter to love from exactly the distance she'd chosen, a close enough to matter, far enough away to let her make her own choices about whether that mattered to her. But I would be there. 50 yards away, but then nonetheless, and maybe Just maybe, she would feel my presence the way I'd always felt hers, even across the growing distance between us, like gravity, like magnetism, like the invisible force that connects mothers and daughters, no matter how hard they try to pull apart. The rental contract for the Montgrove estate felt like a declaration of independence in my hands. Ezra had been gracious enough to drive it to my cottage personally, arriving in a vintage Land Rover that looked like it had been maintained with the same care he clearly lavished on the estate. "I hope you don't mind the house call," he said as I invited him in for coffee. I wanted to meet the woman brave enough to host her own celebration 50 yards from where she's been deliberately excluded. He was exactly what I'd expected from his voice, tall and lean, probably in his early 70s, with silver hair that looked like he'd forgotten to comb it, and wearing a cable-knit sweater that had seen better decades. There was something deeply comfortable about him, like a favorite professor who'd become a friend. "I'm not sure brave is the right word," I said, pouring coffee into mugs that had replaced my grandmother's broken china. "Stubborn, maybe, possibly. Stupid, nonsense." He settled into my kitchen chair as if he belonged there. "Do you know how many people spend their entire lives waiting for permission to take up space? You've decided to grant yourself permission. That's revolutionary." I liked him immediately. There was something about the way he looked around my cottage, not judging but appreciating, taking in the paintings on the walls, and the books stacked on every available surface with the eye of someone who understood that a home should reflect the soul of its inhabitant. "Tell me about the estate," I said. "How long have you owned it?" 23 years. "I bought it after my wife died, thinking I needed space to write without interruption. Turned out grief doesn't require privacy. It finds you wherever you are. But the estate needed someone to care for it, and I needed something to care for. It worked out. You're a writer, novelist. Mostly literary fiction that 12 people read and 3 people understand," he smiled. "But the estate keeps me busy. I host events, rent out the various buildings, occasionally take in stray artists who need a quiet place to work. It's become something of a sanctuary for people who don't quite fit elsewhere." I thought about that phrase of people who don't quite fit elsewhere. It felt like an accurate description of where I'd landed in life. "The West Wing," I said. "What's it like?" "Beautiful. Originally built for the estate owner's mother-in-law, back when families were larger and more complicated. It has its own entrance through the West Gardens, completely private, but with a lovely view of the bay. The dining room seats 10 comfortably. And there's a piano if your violinist needs accompaniment." "A piano?" 1920s baby grand. My wife was a pianist. I couldn't bear to get rid of it, but I rarely play anymore. It would be nice to hear music in that room again. There was something wistful in his voice that made me want to ask about his wife, but I sensed that was a story for another time. "About the dinner party," I said. "I should be honest. I don't actually have 8 people confirmed yet. I'm still working on the guest list." "Oh," he nodded sagely. "The guest list. That's always the tricky part, isn't it? Who do we invite to witness our moments of rebellion?" "Exactly. I'm trying to figure out who would understand what I'm doing and why. May I make a suggestion? Please, don't invite people who will understand. Invite people who will simply show up. Understanding is overrated. A presence is what matters." I thought about that as we discussed logistics of catering options, music selection, the practicalities of hosting a dinner party in a rented space while my daughter celebrated 50 yards away. Ezra had a way of making the whole enterprise feel not just reasonable but elegant, as if parallel celebrations were a sophisticated solution to family complications rather than the desperate gesture of an excluded mother. "One more thing," he said as he prepared to leave. "The violinist I mentioned earlier called her. He's actually performing at your daughter's wedding as well. Would that be awkward for you?" I considered it. Having the same musician at both events would. create a strange connection between our parallel celebrations, a bridge across the careful distance Briony had constructed. I think it's perfect, I said. Maybe he can carry some of the joy from one party to the other. After Ezra left, I sat with the contract spread out on my kitchen table and made my first phone call. Iris Designs, this is Marie. Is Iris available? This is Celeste Barnon. One moment, please. I heard the familiar chaos of Iris's studio in the background, sewing machines and music, and the sound of creative energy in motion, then her voice. Bright and immediate, Celeste, please tell me you've decided to do something dramatic about this wedding situation. I'm hosting a dinner party, I said. The same night as Briony's wedding, at the estate next door to her venue, the silence stretched. For several seconds, "You magnificent, crazy woman," Iris said finally. "That's either the most elegant revenge or the most dignified surrender I've ever heard of. I'm hoping for dignified resistance. Even better." When and where, and what should I wear? I gave her the details, and she promised to fly in from Paris, bringing her current boyfriend, a French chef named Antoine who she claimed made the most extraordinary soufflés. "That's two," I said after hanging up. My next call was today, a young chef I'd met at the farmer's market. He'd been working at a restaurant in Bar Harbor but had mentioned wanting to branch out into private catering. When I explained what I needed, he was immediately intrigued. "So it's like a counter wedding," he said. "That's brilliant. What kind of menu are you thinking? Something that feels celebratory, but not competitive. Elegant comfort food. Maybe. I have the perfect idea. Trust me, completely." 3 down, 5 to go. I spent the afternoon walking through Camden, thinking about community and connection and the difference between family and chosen family. By evening, I had my list. There was Margaret, my across-the-street neighbour, a retired librarian who'd been bringing me soup whenever I looked peaked and who had strong opinions about family loyalty. There was Tom, the owner of the local bookstore where I'd been volunteering, reading to children on Saturday mornings. There was Sarah, a fellow artist I'd met at a gallery opening who'd become a friend despite our 30-year age difference. Each phone call was an exercise in vulnerability. I had to explain the situation, admit to my exclusion, and ask people to join me in what might look like elaborate self-pity. But each person said yes immediately, without judgment or lengthy explanations. "Required," Margaret simply said. "What can I bring?" Tom said, "Count me in. I love a good unconventional celebration." Sarah said, "That takes guts." I'm honored to be included. By the time I made my final call to Dr. Aylana Rodriguez, the therapist who'd helped me navigate the divorce and who'd become a friend, I was beginning to understand what Ezra had meant about presence being what mattered. "Celeste," Aylana said after I'd explained everything, "this sounds like exactly what you need to do. You don't think it's pathetic throwing myself a party because my own daughter doesn't want me at hers? I think it's self-advocacy. I think it's refusing to accept that love has to look like erasure. I think it's beautiful. 8 people. 8 individuals who barely knew each other, but who were willing to show up for me at a moment that felt like make or break for my sense of self-worth. That night, I sat on my back porch and looked across the water toward the Montgrove estate. In 10 days, it would be full of celebration and music and laughter and all the rituals that mark new beginnings. And 50 yards away, in the West Wing, I would be hosting my own celebration of love and chosen family and the quiet courage it takes to insist on your own worth. I thought about Briony, probably finalizing seating charts and menu selections, making last-minute decisions about flowers and photography. Did she ever think about me in those moments? Did she ever wonder what I was doing, how I was handling the exclusion, whether I would find a way to be present for her happiness despite her decision to keep me away? I hope she did. I hoped that somewhere in the busyness of wedding planning, she felt the pull of our connection, the invisible cord that had bound us together since the moment she was born. I hoped she would sense my presence on her wedding day, feel my love and my joy for her happiness even if she couldn't see it directly. But even if she didn't, even if my parallel celebration went completely unnoticed, it would still matter. It would still be a declaration that I refused to disappear, that love didn't require permission to express itself, that mothers could find ways to celebrate their children, even from a distance. The rental contract sat on my kitchen table like a promise I'd made to myself. In 10 days, I would keep that promise. I would show up for my daughter's wedding in the only way she'd allowed, and I would do it with grace and dignity and surrounded by people who understood that love was worth celebrating no matter how complicated the circumstances. It wasn't the mother of the bride experience I'd dreamed of, but it was authentically mine, and that was something I'd forgotten how to value. For the first time in 5 years, I was making a choice based on what I needed rather than what others expected from me. For the first time since my divorce, I was taking up space in the world rather than apologizing for my existence. The woman who'd opened a gallery and fought for unknown artists was still in there somewhere. She'd just been quiet for a while, waiting for a moment important enough to speak up again. This moment felt important enough. The weathered recipe box sat on my kitchen counter like an accusation. I'd pulled it down from the top shelf of my pantry while searching for my grandmother's dinner roll recipe, thinking I might contribute something homemade to the catered meal at the West Wing. But now, with the box open and its contents spread across the counter, I was drowning in memories I hadn't expected to surface. Every index card told a story of maternal intention. Briony's birthday cake, triple chocolate written in my careful script when she turned 7, Christmas cookies. Her favourites with notes about which shapes she preferred and how she liked extra sprinkles. Sick day soup with variations depending on whether she had a cold or just needed comfort. I collected these recipes like prayers, each one a way of nourishing my daughter, of creating traditions that would bind us together across time. I'd imagined passing them down to her when she got married, teaching her the family secrets for perfect pie crust and the right ratio of love to flour in my mother's biscuits. Instead, here I was, 5 days before her wedding, surrounded by recipes for a life I'd apparently been excluded from. Graduation brunch. Eggs Benedict was written on a card stained with hollandaise sauce, a reminder of the morning after Briony received her master's degree in event planning. I'd been so proud, watching her accept her diploma, seeing the confidence in her stride as she walked across the stage. We'd celebrated afterward at my cottage, just the two of us, and I'd made her favourite breakfast while she told me about her plans to start her own business. I want to create experiences that matter, she'd said, her eyes bright with possibility. Moments that people remember forever. I'd thought then that we were close, that the rocky teenage years and the divorce upheaval were behind us. She'd seemed genuinely happy that morning, curled up in my kitchen in her pajamas, eating eggs Benedict and talking about her dreams. When had that changed? When had I become someone whose experiences didn't matter to her? I picked up another card. Mother's Day tea party with a menu I'd created for her 8th birthday when she decided she wanted to celebrate like a proper lady. Tiny sandwiches with the crust cut off, miniature scones with jam and cream, delicate petit fours that took me hours to decorate. She'd worn her best dress and insisted I wear mine, and we'd spent the afternoon pretending to be sophisticated while giggling over our matching pearl necklaces. That little girl who'd wanted to have tea parties with her mother had grown into a woman who didn't want her mother at her wedding. The transformation felt too dramatic to be real, like a fairy tale in reverse where the princess turned back into a scullery maid. My phone rang, interrupting my melancholy inventory. The caller ID showed Eleanor's name. "How are you holding up?" she asked without preamble. I'm sitting in my kitchen surrounded by 26 years worth of recipes I made for a daughter who apparently doesn't want them anymore. Ah, you found the recipe box. Alana knew me well enough to understand the significance. We talked about it during my divorce, how the recipes represented more than just food. They were my attempts to create continuity, to build family traditions that would outlast any single relationship. I keep thinking I should give them to her, I said, before the wedding. Maybe include them with a gift or something. Do you think she wants them? The question hung in the air. A year ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Now, I wasn't sure Briony wanted anything from me that might complicate her carefully curated new life. I don't know, I admitted. She's built this very clean, modern existence. My recipes probably feel messy and old-fashioned, or they might feel like love, or they might feel like pressure. Another way of me trying to insert myself into a life where I'm not wanted. I heard Eleanor's careful silence, the space she always left for me to work through my own thoughts. Alana, can I ask you something? As both my therapist and my friend, of course. Do you think I'm making a mistake with this dinner party? Is this just elaborate self-torture disguised as empowerment? What do you think? I think I'm terrified that I'm becoming one of those mothers who can't let go. The kind who shows up uninvited and makes everyone uncomfortable because she can't accept that her child has moved on. And I think I'm also terrified of disappearing entirely. Of accepting that love requires invisibility. Those are both valid fears. Which one feels more dangerous to you right now? I looked around my kitchen, at the evidence of a life spent nourishing others, at the recipes that would probably die with me unless I found someone else to care about them. Disappearing, I said quietly. I'm more afraid of disappearing than trust that instinct. You're not trying to disrupt her wedding or insert yourself into spaces where you're not wanted. You're creating your own space, with your own people, to celebrate in your own way. That's not pathological, that's healthy. After Alana hung up, I sat with the recipes spread out before me and thought about legacy. What did it mean to pass things down when your child didn't want to receive them? What happened to traditions when there was no one to carry them forward? I started organizing the cards, not chronologically, but by theme. Birthday celebrations in one pile, holiday traditions in another, comfort foods and sick day remedies and special occasion treats. Each pile represented a different aspect of motherhood, a different way I tried to show love through the simple act of feeding my daughter. Some of the cards had notes in Briony's handwriting, modifications she'd suggested, ingredient she'd asked me to add or subtract, more vanilla in the birthday cake, less salt in the chicken soup. Can we make the cookies smaller so I can eat more of them? Her child's handwriting, careful and round, documenting her preferences and making the recipes a collaboration between us. Those notes felt like archaeological evidence of our relationship, proof that she'd once cared enough to engage with my cooking, to make suggestions and improvements. When had she stopped caring about these small domestic pleasures? When had shared meals become obligations rather than connections? I thought about the last time she'd been in my kitchen. Almost 6 months ago, she'd stopped by briefly while running errands in Camden, and I'd offered to make her lunch. She'd declined, saying she was watching her carbs and didn't have time anyway. I'd felt dismissed then, but I'd told myself she was just busy, just focused on her work and her life in Rockland. Now I wondered if she'd already started the process of detaching, of creating distance between us so that excluding me from her wedding would feel natural rather than cruel. I picked up the card for Sunday morning pancakes, a tradition we'd maintained throughout her childhood, no matter what else was happening in our family. Even during the worst periods of my marriage, even when Richard was traveling or we were fighting, Briony and I had our Sunday morning pancakes. They were our constant, our weekly celebration of being mother and daughter, The recipe was simple: flour, eggs, milk, a touch of vanilla, a pinch of salt. But I'd written detailed notes about technique. Mix just until combined lumps are okay. Let the batter rest while the griddle heats. First side is done when bubbles form and pop. Instructions for creating something that could only be. Learn through practice, through standing beside someone who knew the rhythm and sharing the process. I taught Briony to make these pancakes when she was 10, letting her measure and stir, while I supervised. She'd been so proud the first time she made them entirely on her own, calling me into the kitchen to see her perfect golden circles arranged on a plate. "Look, Mum, I did it," she'd said, and her face had been radiant with accomplishment. Would she teach her children to make pancakes? Would she remember the techniques I'd passed down to her? Or would she learn new recipes that better fit her new life? I closed the recipe box and carried it to my studio. If Briony didn't want these traditions, maybe I could find another way to honor them. Maybe I could paint them, create a series of still lifes featuring the dishes that had defined our relationship, not as a way of holding on to the past, but as a way of celebrating what had been beautiful about it, even if it was ending. My phone buzzed with a text message from Iris, landed in Boston. "Driving up tomorrow. Antoine is bringing ingredients for something he calls soufflé du triomphe. Apparently, it's what French people eat when they're making elegant points. Can't wait to see you in action." I smiled despite my melancholy. Iris had always understood the importance of making elegant points. She'd built her fashion career on the principle that how you presented yourself to the world was a form of communication, that style was a way of insisting on your own worth even when others tried to diminish it. Maybe that's what this dinner party was, a form of communication. Not a message to Briony, necessarily, but to myself. A way of saying that I refused to let my love be reduced to absence, that I could find ways to celebrate her happiness even if she couldn't see it. I thought about the violinist who would play at both events, carrying music between our parallel celebrations. What songs would he play for us? What melodies would connect my small gathering to her grand celebration? I made a mental note to ask Ezra about requesting specific pieces. Maybe something by Bach, something mathematically perfect and emotionally complex, music that could hold joy and sorrow simultaneously, something that could soundtrack both a wedding and a quiet rebellion, both a celebration and a goodbye, because maybe that's what this was. Not just a hello to a new way of loving my daughter, but a goodbye to the mother I'd thought I would be. The mother who would help plan the wedding, who would have opinions about flowers and cake flavors, who would dance with the father of the bride and give speeches about watching her daughter grow up. That mother was gone now, replaced by someone who had to love more quietly, more carefully, with fewer expectations and more grace. It was a harder way to love, but maybe it was also more honest. Maybe this was what it meant to love an adult child, to step back and let them choose the terms of the relationship, even when those terms felt like rejection. The recipe box would stay in my studio for now, neither given nor thrown away, but transformed into something new. The traditions might not continue in the way I'd imagined, but they could still exist as art, as memory, as proof that love had been present in our kitchen every Sunday morning for 18 years, and maybe someday, if Briony ever wanted them, they would still be here, waiting to be rediscovered and perhaps reclaimed. Love, I was learning, didn't have to be immediate to be real. Sometimes it could wait patiently in a studio, in a recipe box, in the memory of pancakes that were once made with joy and shared with hope. The photograph fell out of Clary's purse, like an accusation, fluttering to the ground during what should have been a routine encounter at the Camden Farmers Market. I bent to pick it up before she could stop me, and the image hit me like a physical blow. Briony at age 7, gap-toothed and radiant, wearing the paint-stained overalls I'd bought her for our Saturday morning art sessions. "That's mine, Clary." said quickly, reaching for the photo, but I was already studying it with the hunger of someone who'd been denied recent images of her child. It was one of mine. I recognized my own photography, the way I'd captured the light in Briony's eyes, as she held up a finger painting of our garden. But how had Clary gotten it? And why was she carrying it in her purse 3 days before a wedding when my presence was deemed too disruptive to tolerate? Where did you get this? I asked, still holding the photograph. Clary's perfectly composed face flickered with something that might have been guilt. She was dressed in her usual armour of tasteful neutrals, beige linen pants, cream silk blouse, the kind of understated elegance that whispered expensive restraint. Everything about her presentation was calculated to suggest refined maturity, the antithesis of what she'd always positioned as my chaotic creativity. Briony gave it to me, she said, finally meeting my eyes. She was going through some old albums. But that didn't make sense. The photo wasn't from an album. I could tell by the way the edges were slightly bent, as if it had been handled frequently. And why would Briony give Clary a picture of herself as a child with me, especially during wedding preparations, when she was supposedly trying to minimize my presence in her life? Why do you have it? I pressed. Clary glanced around the farmer's market, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of our encounter. Other shoppers were beginning to notice our tense conversation, recognizing the careful distance that mothers and stepmothers usually maintained in small Maine communities. I think we should discuss this privately, she said. I almost laughed. Privately. After 8 years of careful avoidance, suddenly she wanted privacy for a conversation we should have had long ago. I think we should discuss it now, I said. Since you seem to have plenty of pictures of my daughter that I don't understand. The plural was a guess, but her expression confirmed it. There were more photos, more pieces of Briony's life with me that had somehow ended up in Clary's possession. Celeste, please. Not here. Then where? When? You've spent 8 years making sure we're never in the same place at the same time. She looked around again, calculating. Margaret from across the street was openly watching us now, her weekly vegetable shopping forgotten in favour of this unexpected drama. The coffee shop, Clary said, finally, in 10 minutes. I nodded and handed her back the photograph, watching as she tucked it carefully into her purse. My hands were shaking as I finished my own shopping, buying tomatoes and herbs I didn't need while my mind raced with questions. The coffee shop was nearly empty on a Tuesday morning. Clary had chosen a corner table, her back to the wall, her purse clutched protectively in her lap. I ordered tea and sat across from her, studying the woman who had somehow gained more influence over my daughter than I had. She was beautiful in the way that money and maintenance could create, not striking, but polished to a shine that suggested careful attention to detail. Her blonde hair was professionally highlighted, her manicure perfect, her jewelry subtle but expensive. Everything about her whispered stability, predictability, the kind of maternal presence that wouldn't embarrass you at school functions or make inappropriate comments at dinner parties. How many photos do you have? I asked without preamble. What does it matter? It matters because my daughter is getting married in 3 days, and apparently, you know more about her childhood than she's willing to share with me. Clary opened her purse and pulled out a small manila envelope. She hesitated for a moment, then slid it across the table. These were in a box in Briony's old room, she said. Richard was going to throw them away during spring cleaning. I saved them. I opened the envelope with careful fingers. Inside were dozens of photographs spanning Briony's childhood, her first day of school, Christmas mornings, birthday parties, summer vacations. All moments I'd captured and cherished, all images that should have been mine to keep. But they weren't just random photos. As I looked through them, I realised they were specifically chosen, pictures of Briony with me, just the two of us, documenting the close relationship we'd share before everything became complicated. Briony on my shoulders at the beach. Briony and me covered in flour while baking cookies. Briony asleep in my lap while I read to her. Why did you say these? I asked. Clary was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee with mechanical precision. Because she looks happy, she said finally. In every single one, she looks completely happy. The admission hung between us like a confession. I looked up from the photos to find Clary watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I don't understand. She doesn't look that happy in pictures with me, Clary said quietly. She tries to, but there's always something guarded about her expression. Like she's performing happiness rather than feeling it. I set down the photos, stunned by her honesty. Then why work so hard to keep us apart? Because Richard asked me to. The words came out flat, matter of fact, but I heard the weight behind them. What do you mean? Clary took a shaky breath. When we first got together, he was so angry about the divorce, about the custody arrangements, about having to split holidays, about feeling like he always came second to your relationship with Briony. He said the only way our marriage would work was if I helped him create clear boundaries, boundaries that excluded me, boundaries that prioritized our nuclear family. He said Briony needed to learn that she couldn't have both worlds, that she had to choose between her old life and her new one. I felt sick. So you made her choose. I followed my husband's lead. I thought I was helping create stability for her by systematically undermining her relationship with her mother. By giving her permission to stop feeling guilty about wanting different things than what you taught her to want. The coffee shop seemed to shrink around us. I could hear the espresso machine hissing, conversations from other tables, the normal sounds of people going about their Tuesday morning routines, while my understanding of the last 8 years crumbled and reformed. What kinds of things? Traditional things. Normal things. She wanted to go to college for business instead of art. She wanted to wear pretty dresses instead of your vintage finds. She wanted to have friends whose parents worked regular jobs and took normal vacations. She wanted to be conventional, Celeste. And you made her feel like that was a betrayal of everything you taught her. I thought about teenage Briony, rolling her eyes at my gallery openings, refusing to come with me to art shows, gradually pulling away from the creative world that had been our shared language. I'd interpreted her rejection of art as a phase, a normal teenage rebellion that would pass once she figured out who she was. I'd never considered that she might be rejecting me. I never tried to stop her from making her own choices. You didn't have to. Your disappointment was written all over your face every time she chose differently than you would have. Was that true? Had I been that transparent in my feelings about her life choices? I thought about the last few years, the careful conversations where I'd tried to show interest in her business, her apartment, her conventional aspirations. Had my efforts to be supportive come across as condescending? So the solution was to cut me out entirely. The solution was to give her space to become who she wanted to be without feeling like she was disappointing you every step of the way. I picked up one of the photographs, Briony at age 9, paint in her hair, grinning as she showed off a sculpture we'd made together. She looked so completely herself in that moment, so unguarded and joyful. She was happy with me, I said quietly. Yes, but she was also becoming someone else. And she was afraid that if she let you see who she was becoming, you wouldn't love her anymore. The truth of it hit me like a punch to the chest. How many times had I made subtle comments about her choices? How many times had I suggested alternatives to her business degree, her traditional apartment, her conventional friends? I thought I was encouraging her to stay open to possibilities. Instead, I'd been communicating that her actual choices weren't good enough. The wedding, I said, was excluding me, her idea or yours. Clary looked down at her hands. It was mine. But she agreed to it. Why? Because I told her that if you were there, you'd find a way to make it about your feelings instead of her happiness. I told her that you'd never be able to just celebrate without also mourning the daughter you'd lost. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but the accusation had enough truth in it to silence me. Wouldn't I have spent the entire wedding thinking about what might have been different? Wouldn't I have looked at her in her dress and remembered the little girl who used to play dress up in my old gowns? Wouldn't part of me have been grieving the relationship we'd lost even while celebrating the woman she'd become? You were probably right, I admitted. I wish I hadn't been. We sat in silence for several minutes. The photos spread between us like evidence of a crime we'd both committed in different ways. Clary, I said finally, do you love her? Yes, not the way you do, but yes. Then help me understand something. If you love her, and if these photos prove that she was happy with me, why are you working so hard to keep that happiness in the past? She picked up one of the photos, the one from the farmer's market, the 7-year-old Briony with paint-stained overalls. Because I'm afraid, she said quietly. Of what? That if she starts remembering how much she loved you, she realizes how much she's lost. And that will break her heart all over again. So instead, you're breaking mine. Yes, I thought that was easier. Cleaner. I gathered the photos and slipped them back into the envelope. They belong to me, these images of my daughter's childhood. But somehow holding them felt like holding evidence of my own failure to love her well enough to keep her. The dinner party, I said. Do you know about it? Clary nodded. Richard told me. He thinks you're having some kind of breakdown. What do you think? She considered the question seriously. I think you're doing what I should have encouraged her to do years ago, which is refusing to choose between loving people. Creating space for everyone instead of forcing exclusions. I stood to leave, then turned back. Clary, can I ask you something? Yes, if you could do it over again, would you change anything? She was quiet for so long, I thought she wasn't going to answer. I would have given you the photo sooner, she said finally. And I would have trusted that love is big enough to hold more than one version of happiness. Outside the coffee shop, I sat in my car and looked through the photographs one more time. Each image told the story of a mother and daughter who had genuinely enjoyed each other's company, who had created joy together, who had shared a language of creativity and wonder that had defined the first part of Briony's life. That mother and daughter were gone now, replaced by two women who barely knew how to talk to each other. But maybe that was okay. Maybe growing up meant outgrowing some relationships, even the ones that had once been perfect. Maybe my dinner party wasn't about trying to reclaim that lost closeness. Maybe it was about honoring what had been beautiful about our relationship, while accepting what it had become. Maybe it was about loving her enough to celebrate her happiness from whatever distance she needed, even if that distance felt like forever. I tucked the photos into my purse and drove toward the Montgrove estate. In 2 days, I would host a dinner party 50 yards from my daughter's wedding. It wouldn't change anything between us, but it would prove something to myself, that love could exist without permission, that mothers could find ways to honor their children even when they weren't wanted, that some relationships were worth celebrating even if they had to be celebrated quietly. The photographs would go in my studio, not to torture myself with what I'd lost, but to remember what had been real. Love had existed between Briony and me. It might not look the same now, but it had been genuine and deep and transformative for both of us. That was worth holding on to, even if everything else had to be let go. The vintage opera record spun on the turntable in the West Wing as I adjusted. The final play setting, Maria Callas's voice filling the dining room with an intensity that seemed to match the electricity in the air. In 3 hours, Briony's wedding would begin 50 yards away, and in 1 hour, my 8 guests would arrive for what had become something far more significant than a simple dinner party. The space was transformed. Ezra had outdone himself, creating an atmosphere that was elegant without being competitive, celebratory without being desperate. White roses and peonies filled crystal vases, their soft fragrance mixing with the salt air that drifted through the open French doors. The table gleamed with fine china and silver, candles waiting to be lit when the sun began to set over Penobscot Bay. "It's perfect," said Day, surveying his culinary preparations from the doorway. He'd arrived that morning with arms full of ingredients and a determined expression, transforming the West Wing's kitchen into something that belonged in a magazine. "The lamb is resting, the vegetables are prepped, and I've got 3 kinds of bread rising. Your guests are going to think they've stumbled into heaven," I smiled, adjusting a fork that didn't need adjusting. "Have you heard anything from next door? Music started about an hour ago." "Sounds like they're doing their rehearsal." The violinist, Leo, he stopped by earlier to tune the piano. Seemed like a thoughtful young man. Leo had been Ezra's suggestion, a recent graduate of the New England Conservatory who was building his reputation playing private events along the Maine coast. When he'd arrived that morning, I'd been struck by his quiet intensity, the way he'd listen to my request for music that could hold both joy and sorrow, that could soundtrack a celebration that was also a goodbye. "I want the music to feel like a bridge," I'd told him, "something that connects rather than competes." He'd nodded as if he understood exactly what I meant, then spent an hour moving between the piano and his violin, finding pieces that seemed to capture the complexity of the evening ahead. Now, with Callis singing about love and loss in Italian, I felt the weight of what I was attempting. This wasn't just a dinner party anymore. It had become a statement, a declaration, a way of insisting that love could exist without permission and celebration didn't require invitation. Iris arrived first. As I'd known she would, she swept in too. The West Wing like a force of nature, resplendent in a flowing silk dress that managed to be both elegant and subtly rebellious, the kind of outfit that suggested she belonged at any celebration, invited or not. "Darling," she said, enveloping me in a cloud of expensive perfume and fierce affection, "you look absolutely luminous." Heartbreak becomes you. Behind her came Antoine, her current boyfriend, carrying a basket that promised soufflés and other French delights. He was exactly what I'd expected. Charming, slightly pretentious, and utterly devoted to Iris in the way that creative people often were when they found someone who appreciated their artistry. "Madame Celeste," he said, kissing both my cheeks. "Iris has told me of your situation, what you are doing. It is très courageous." Very French, actually, this idea of parallel celebrations. Margaret arrived next, bearing a bottle of champagne, and wearing the kind of dress that suggested she'd been saving it for a special occasion. She'd done her white hair in an elaborate style that reminded me of 1940s movie stars, and her eyes sparkled with the anticipation of someone who rarely got to participate in dramatic gestures. "I've been looking forward to this all week," she announced. "It's about time someone in this town did something interesting." Tom and Sarah arrived together, having discovered during my phone calls that they lived only a few blocks apart. Tom had brought a selection of wines that suggested serious thought about pairings, while Sarah carried a small wrapped package that she handed to me with a shy smile. "It's not much," she said. "Just something I made in the studio." Inside was a small ceramic bowl, glazed in shades of blue that reminded me of the bay at twilight. The kind of piece that would hold jewelry or sea glass or other small treasures. The kind of gift that said "I see you" in the way that only artists could express. Eleanor arrived precisely on time, as I'd known she would, carrying herself with the quiet confidence that had helped me through the darkest parts of my divorce. She assessed the scene with professional eyes before relaxing into genuine pleasure. "This is beautiful, Celeste. You've created something really special here." The last to arrive was someone I hadn't expected, Ezra himself, carrying a bottle of what looked like very old scotch and wearing a dinner jacket that had probably been tailored in the 1970s. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," he said. "But I couldn't resist being part of whatever this turns out to be. I minded not at all. His presence felt like a blessing, the approval of someone who understood both hospitality and the complexities of the human heart. As we gathered in the living room for cocktails, I could hear the distant sounds of preparation from the main estate. Laughter and music, the clutter of final arrangements, the energy of a celebration building toward its crescendo. For a moment, I felt the sharp pang of exclusion, the knowledge that 50 yards away, my daughter was getting ready for the most important day of her life without any thought of me. But then Day appeared with a tray of hors d'oeuvres that were small works of art, and Leo began playing something soft and beautiful on the piano, and my guest settled into the kind of conversation that happens when strangers become allies in someone else's act of courage. Tell us about her, Iris said, settling next to me. With a glass of champagne, what was she like as a little girl? And so I found myself sharing stories I hadn't told in years. Briony at age 5, insisting on wearing her Halloween costume to the grocery store in January. Briony at 8, writing elaborate plays that she'd visit the neighborhood children to perform in our backyard. Briony at 12, discovering photography and spending entire afternoons capturing the light in our garden. My guest listened with the attention of people who understood that these stories were precious, that sharing them was an act of trust. They asked questions that showed they were really hearing me, that they saw Briony not as a source of my pain, but as a whole person worthy of celebration. She sounds wonderful, Margaret said. Complex and creative and strong-willed, the kind of daughter who was bound to make her own path, regardless of what anyone expected. Exactly, Elena added. And the fact that she's capable of making difficult decisions, even ones that hurt people she loves, suggests you raised her to be independent and self-possessed. I hadn't thought of it that way, that Briony's ability to exclude me might actually be evidence of successful parenting rather than failed relationship. The idea was both comforting and devastating. As the sun began to set, we moved to the dining room. Day had outdone himself, course after course of food that was both sophisticated and comforting, each dish presented with the kind of care that elevated a meal into an experience. The lamb was perfect, the vegetables singing with flavor, the bread warm and fragrant with herbs from the estate's own garden. Leo moved between piano and violin, creating a soundtrack that seemed to respond to the mood of the room. During the soup course, he played something light and conversational. As we moved through the main course, the music became more complex, more emotionally rich. By the time Antoine's soufflé arrived, a triumph of French technique that drew applause from the entire table, the music had taken on a celebratory quality that made us all feel like we were part of something magical. You know, Tom said, raising his wine glass, I've been to a lot of dinner parties in my life, but I've never been to one with this much meaning behind it. What kind of meaning do you see? I asked. The meaning of insisting on love, even when it's not convenient. The meaning of creating space for celebration, even when you're not invited to participate in the traditional way. The meaning of refusing to let other people's limitations define your own capacity for joy. Around the table, heads nodded in agreement. These relative strangers had somehow become my chosen family for the evening, witnesses to my determination to honor my daughter's happiness in the only way she'd allow. As if summoned by our conversation, we began to hear sounds from the main estate. Music starting, cars arriving, the distant murmur of guests gathering for Briony's wedding. I felt my chest tighten with a familiar ache, the physical sensation of being so close to something precious that I couldn't touch. Should we move to the terrace? Ezra suggested gently. We could have dessert outside, enjoy the evening air. He understood, I realized, that I needed to acknowledge what was happening 50 yards away, that pretending to be unaware of my daughter's wedding would have been its own kind of denial. We carried our wine glasses outside, where Day had arranged a selection of small desserts on a table overlooking the bay. The main estate was visible through the trees, its windows glowing with warm light, figures in formal wear moving across the lawn. I could see the wedding tent, elegant and white, with strings of lights creating the kind of magical atmosphere that Briony had probably dreamed of since she was a little girl. "It's beautiful," Sarah said softly. "It is," I agreed, and I meant it. Whatever pain I felt at being excluded, I could still appreciate the beauty of what my daughter had created, the elegance of the celebration she'd planned, the joy that was. Clearly radiating from the gathering, Leo had followed us outside with his violin, and now he began to play something that seemed to drift across the evening air toward the main celebration. It was Bach, the Arioso from Cantata 156, a piece that managed to be both mournful and transcendent, perfect for marking moments of transition and loss, and new beginning. As the music flowed around us, I realized that this was exactly what I'd needed, not to crash my daughter's wedding or insert myself into spaces where I wasn't wanted, but to create my own space for witnessing her happiness. To be present without being intrusive, to celebrate without competing, to love without demanding. Acknowledgement. "Thank you," I said to my assembled guests. "Thank you for understanding what this meant and for helping me do it with dignity." "Thank you," Iris replied, "for showing us what courage looks like when it's wrapped in grace." As the evening deepened, and the music from both celebrations mingled in the salt air, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. Not the peace of resolution or reconciliation, but the peace of acceptance. I would probably never understand all the reasons for my exclusion from Briony's wedding. I might never repair the damage that had accumulated over years of miscommunication and competing loyalties. But I had proven something to myself tonight, that love could exist without permission, that mothers could find ways to honor their children, even from a distance, that celebration was a choice that belonged to the celebrant rather than a privilege granted by others. 50 yards away, my daughter was dancing at her wedding. Here, surrounded by people who had chosen to witness my love for her, I was dancing too, to different music, in a different space, but with the same essential joy that comes from honoring what matters most. The letter arrived during dessert, delivered by a young man in a catering uniform who appeared at the edge of our terrace like a ghost materializing from the main celebration. He approached hesitantly, clearly unsure whether he was supposed to interrupt our gathering. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you Celeste Varnon?" My heart stopped. 50 yards away, Briony's wedding was reaching its peak. I could hear the band playing, see the dancers moving under the tent, feel the energy of a celebration in full swing. And now someone was looking for me, connecting our parallel universes in a way I hadn't anticipated. I said carefully. "The bride asked me to give you this." He handed me an envelope, cream-colored, heavy paper, my name written in Briony's careful handwriting, the same script I'd seen on school projects and birthday cards. On the note, she used to leave me when she was running late or needed something from the store. My hand shook as I took the envelope. Around the table, my guests had gone quiet, understanding that something significant was happening, but not sure whether to stay or give me privacy. "Should we?" Aelana began. "No," I said quickly. "Please stay. Whatever this is, I want you here for it." I opened the envelope carefully, as if it might contain something fragile that could be damaged by rough handling. Inside was a single sheet of paper filled with Briony's handwriting. The kind of letter that looked like it had been written and rewritten, with thoughts crossed out and additions squeezed into margins. "Mum," it began. I had to stop reading for a moment and take a breath. She hadn't called me Mum in our last several conversations, had instead used my name with the careful distance of someone trying to create formal boundaries. Seeing the word in her handwriting felt like a gift I hadn't known I was waiting for. "Mum, I know you're there. I can hear the music from your dinner party. And I know it's you because who else would hire Leo to play Bach at a wedding reception? He told me about the Orioso. It's perfect, by the way, heartbreaking and beautiful, just like you always taught me art should be. I've been trying to work up the courage to walk over there all evening. I've gotten as far as the garden gate 3 times, but every time I see you through the trees, looking so elegant and composed, hosting your own celebration with such grace, I lose my nerve. I need you to know that excluding you from today wasn't about not loving you. It was about loving you too much to risk having our relationship become another casualty of my wedding day. Clary told me about your conversation at the coffee shop. She told me about the photos, about the things she said to you, about the ways she and Dad convinced me that choosing between my old life and my new one was necessary for everyone's happiness. I'm angry about it, Mom. Angry that they made me believe I had to choose. Angry that I was too scared to question that belief. Angry that I let other people's discomfort with complexity override my own need for wholeness. But I'm also angry at myself, because even if they influenced my decision, it was still my decision. I'm the one who stopped calling us orphan. I'm the one who visited less and less. I'm the one who gradually began to see your love as pressure instead of gift. I think I was afraid that if I stay close to you, I wouldn't be able to become the person I wanted to be. You raised me to be creative and questioning and authentically myself, but somewhere along the way I decided I wanted to be conventional instead. I wanted to fit in, to build a life that looked normal and predictable and safe. I was afraid you would be disappointed in the choices I was making, so I started making those choices without telling you about them. And the distance that created just kept growing until it felt too wide to cross. Today, watching you create your own celebration 50 yards away from mine, I realized something. You weren't trying to control who I became. You were just trying to love who I was becoming, even when you didn't understand it. I can see your table from here, Mom. I can see you laughing with your friends, see the way they're all looking at you like you're someone worth celebrating, and I realized that's how you always looked at me, like I was someone worth celebrating. No matter what choices I made or how far I wandered from the path you might have chosen for me, I don't know how to fix what's broken between us. I don't know if it can be fixed or if we just have to start over from where we are now. But I want you to know that I hear the music you're playing for me. I hear the love in it, and the sadness, and the hope. After everyone goes home tonight, after Marcus and I have our last dance and cut our cake and said goodbye to all our guests, I'm going to walk over to your celebration. I don't know what we'll say to each other or how we'll begin to rebuild what we've lost. But I want to try. I love you, Mom. I never stopped loving you, even when I was too scared to show it. Your daughter, Briony, S. Save me some cake. I have a feeling yours is going to be better than mine. I finished reading with tears streaming down my face, the letter trembling in my hands. Around the table, my guests sat in respectful silence, understanding that they had witnessed something profound and private. Leo had stopped playing when the letter arrived, but now he began again, something soft and hopeful, a melody that seemed to carry the possibility of healing across the evening air. She's coming over, I said to my assembled friends, my voice barely above a whisper. After the wedding, she's coming over. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Iris reached for my hand and squeezed it. Margaret began to cry openly. Ilona smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had believed in this possibility when I couldn't see it myself. We should go, Tom said gently. Give you privacy for that conversation. No, I said, looking around the table at these people who had become my chosen family for the evening. If you're willing, I'd like you to stay. Not for the conversation. That needs to be private. But for what comes after, I have a feeling. I'm going to need witnesses to whatever happens next. They agreed. Of course, because that's what chosen family does. They show up for the moments that matter. They bear witness to transformation. They hold space for healing even when they don't. Understand all the history that led to the wound. We returned to the celebration, but everything felt different now. The music from both parties seemed to harmonize rather than compete. The distance between the estates felt like anticipation rather than exclusion. The letter had created a bridge between our parallel celebrations, a promise that the evening wasn't ending with separation, but with possibility. I looked across the lawn toward the main estate, where I could see Briony moving among her guests, dancing with her new husband, playing the role of radiant bride with the same attention to detail she brought to all her event planning. But every now and then, I caught her looking in our direction, her gaze finding me across the distance that had defined our relationship for too long. "How do you feel?" Aelana asked, settling beside me on the terrace. "Terrified," I admitted. "What if we don't know how to talk to each other anymore? What if too much damage has been done? What if we start over and it goes wrong again?" "What if it goes right?" she countered. "What if you discover that love really is big enough to hold complexity? What if you find out that relationships can be rebuilt on more honest foundations?" As the evening progressed, I watched my daughter's wedding wind down. Guests began to leave. The band packed up their instruments. The careful choreography of a successful celebration slowly dissolved into the peaceful aftermath of a job well done. And then, around midnight, I saw her, Briony, walking across the lawn, still in her wedding dress, but barefoot now, carrying her shoes in one hand and holding up her skirt with the other. She looked young and nervous and determined, the way she used to look when she was about to attempt something that scared her but that she knew was important. "I'll be back," I told my guests, and I walked down from the terrace to meet her halfway. We stopped a few feet apart, mother and daughter, looking at each other across years of misunderstanding and months of deliberate distance. She was more beautiful than I'd remembered, more mature, more herself than she'd been when I'd last really looked at her. Marriage suited her, not just the dress and the celebration, but the confidence that came with making choices and following through on them. "Hi, Mom. Hi, sweetheart. How was your wedding?" "Beautiful. Perfect, actually. But incomplete." She took a step closer, and I could see that she'd been crying. Not the devastating tears of grief, but the cleansing tears that come with difficult honesty. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry for shutting you out, for letting other people's fears override my own love for you, for being too scared to fight for our relationship when it got complicated. I'm sorry too," I said, "for not seeing that you needed space to become who you were meant to be, for making you feel like my love came with conditions, for not fighting harder to understand what you needed instead of just mourning what I'd lost." We stood there for a moment, all the words we'd needed to say hanging in the air between us. Then Briony smiled, the same radiant, unguarded smile I remembered from the photographs Clary had saved. "Would you like to see my wedding dress up close?" she asked. "I would love that." She spun around, letting the full skirt billow out around her, and I saw my daughter not as the woman who had excluded me or the child I'd lost, but as herself, complex and beautiful, and finding her own way through life with grace and determination. "It's perfect," I said. "You're perfect. Mom, can I ask you something?" "Anything. Next time I get married, will you help me plan it?" I laughed, understanding that she was really asking if we could start over, if we could find a way to be mother and daughter again despite everything that had gone wrong. "Sweetheart," I said, "let's start with helping you stay married to this one." She laughed too, and the sound carried across the night air like music, like healing, like the first note of a song we would spend years learning to sing together. Behind us, I could hear my dinner party guests applauding softly, understanding that they had witnessed something rare and precious, the moment when love finds a way to bridge even the widest distances. When family begins to heal itself through courage and honesty, and the simple refusal to give up on what matters most. 6 months later, I was standing in my studio, putting the finishing touches on a painting I'd been working on since the wedding. It showed the view from the West Wing terrace that night, to celebrations visible in the same frame, music and light flowing between them, love expressed in parallel but ultimately connected ways. The morning light streaming through my windows had that particular quality of late December in Maine, sharp and clear and full of promise. Snow covered the ground outside, but my cottage felt warm and alive in ways it hadn't for years. On my easel next to the painting sat the journal I'd started the day after Briony's wedding, a record of our slow, careful process of rebuilding our relationship. The early entries were tentative, full of awkward phone calls and cautious visits, both of us learning how to love each other without the old patterns of expectation and disappointment. But gradually, the entries had become more confident, documenting the small victories that marked our progress. Briony asking for my opinion about redecorating her apartment. Me learning to offer suggestions without pushing when she chose differently. Her visiting for entire weekends again, just the two of us rediscovering our rhythm. Me attending one of her business presentations, seeing her professional competence and feeling proud rather than surprised. The secret, I'd written in a recent entry, is accepting that relationships can be rebuilt on new foundations. We're not trying to recreate who we used to be to each other. We're discovering who we can be now. The phone rang, interrupting my reflection. Briony's name appeared on the caller ID, still a small miracle after months of resumed regular contact. Hi, sweetheart. Mum, I have news. Her voice carried that particular excitement that meant something significant had happened. Good news or complicated news? Both, probably. Marcus and I are thinking about buying a house. I set down my paintbrush and gave her my full attention. That's wonderful. Where are you looking? Well, that's the complicated part. We found a place we love, but it's in Camden. About 10 minutes from you. I felt my heart jump, but I was careful to keep my voice neutral. And how do you feel about that? Nervous, excited, worried that you'll think we're moving closer because I feel guilty about the wedding. And then you'll feel obligated to spend more time with us than you actually want to. I laughed, recognizing the kind of overthinking that had gotten us into trouble before. Briony, are you moving to Camden because you want to live there? Or because you think you owe me something? Because we want to live there. Marcus grew up in Maine, and I've realized I miss being near the water. Plus, there's something appealing about being close to family without being on top of each other. Then I think it's perfect, and I promise not to show up uninvited with casseroles and advice. I would actually love the occasional casserole. Your chicken and rice was always my favorite. I made a mental note to find that recipe in my weathered recipe box. Some traditions, it seemed, were worth continuing after all. Can I ask you something else? Briony continued, always. Would you want to help us look at the house? I know you have a good eye for these things, and I'd value your opinion. It was such a small request, the kind of thing that mothers and daughters did together all the time. But for us, it represented something significant, Briony choosing to include me in a major life decision, trusting my judgment, wanting my presence during an important moment. I would love that, I said. After we hung up, I walked through my cottage, seeing it with fresh eyes. For 5 years, it had been my refuge. The place I'd retreated to lick my wounds and rebuild my sense of self. But maybe it was time for it to become something more, not just a sanctuary, but an anchor. A place where family could gather, where traditions could be maintained and new ones created, where love could be expressed in simple daily ways rather than grand gestures. I thought about the dinner party at the West Wing, how it had started as an act of defiance and become something much more meaningful. Those 8 people had become genuine friends over the past months, drawn together by their shared witness to that evening of parallel celebrations. We met monthly now, calling ourselves the Montgrove Society and gathering to share meals and support each other through various life transitions. Iris had extended her stay in Maine, renting a cottage in Bar Harbor while she worked on a new fashion line inspired by coastal landscapes. Margaret had become my closest friend, the kind of neighbor who knew when I needed company and when I needed solitude. Aylana and I had developed a friendship that went beyond our therapeutic relationship, bonding over our shared appreciation for the complexity of human emotions. Even Ezra had become a regular presence in my life, showing up for dinner parties and gallery openings with his slightly rumpled elegance and his gift for making everyone feel interesting and appreciated. We developed what I privately thought of as a mature romance, companionship and affection, and shared interest without the desperate intensity of younger love. The recipe box sat on my kitchen counter now, instead of hidden away in my studio. I'd started cooking again, not out of maternal obligation, but out of genuine pleasure in creating nourishment for people I cared about. Some of the recipes I'd adapted for smaller quantities, acknowledging that I was cooking for a different configuration of family now. Others I'd expanded, adding notes for feeding friends and chosen family, and the various people who had wandered into my orbit. My phone buzzed with a text from Briony. House showing is at 2 p.m. on Saturday. Can you meet us there? Address attached. P.S. It has a studio space that would be perfect for painting. I smiled, understanding that she'd mentioned the studio space deliberately, that she was already thinking about ways our lives could intersect if she moved closer. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful gesture that had always been part of her nature, even during the years when we'd struggled to connect. I texted back, wouldn't miss it. P.S. I'll bring my tape measure and my opinions. Perfect, just try. Not to scare the realtor, I was still smiling when I returned to my painting. The final touches involved adding tiny figures to represent the people at both celebrations, small enough to suggest universality, detailed enough to convey the individuality of each person's experience of that evening. In the West Wing section, I painted my dinner party guests, each one captured in a gesture that reflected their personality. Iris with her wine glass raised in a toast, Aylana listening intently to someone's story, Margaret laughing with her whole body. Day emerging from the kitchen with another perfect course. In the main estate section, I painted the wedding party. Figures in formal wear dancing under string lights, the energy of celebration radiating from their poses. And in the center of that group, I painted Briony in her wedding dress, her face turned slightly toward the West Wing, as if she could feel the love flowing toward her from across the lawn. The painting had taken months to complete because I'd wanted to get the balance exactly right, both celebrations given equal weight and beauty, neither one dominating the composition, the music and light flowing between them creating unity rather than competition. It was, I realized, a visual representation of what I'd learned about love over the past 6 months. Love didn't require proximity. To be real, it didn't need permission to exist. It could be expressed in parallel, rather than direct ways, and still be transformative for everyone involved. I'd spent years thinking that loving Briony meant holding on to her, maintaining the close relationship we'd shared when she was young. But the wedding had taught me that sometimes loving someone meant letting them choose the distance they needed while refusing to disappear entirely from their landscape. The studio door opened, and Ezra appeared with a thermos of coffee and his usual slightly disheveled charm. Good morning, artist. How's the masterpiece coming along? I think it's finished, I said, stepping back to look at the painting with him. He studied it seriously, understanding that it represented much more than a simple landscape. It's extraordinary, Celeste. You've captured something essential about that evening, not just what happened, but what it meant. What do you think it meant? That love finds a way, he said simply. Even when it's not invited, even when it's not understood, even when it has to express itself from a distance. Love finds a way to make itself known. I looked at the painting one more time, then carefully moved it to the wall where finished. Pieces waited to find their permanent homes. This one, I thought, would stay with me. It belonged in my cottage, a reminder of what I'd learned about courage and grace, and the different ways that family could exist. My journal lay open on the table nearby, today's date at the top of a blank page. I picked up my pen and wrote, December 15th, Briony called about the house in Camden. 6 months ago, the idea of her moving closer would have felt like vindication, proof that I'd been right to fight for our relationship. Now, it just feels like life continuing to unfold in surprising and beautiful ways. I'm learning that healing doesn't mean going back to how things were. It means accepting what was broken and building something new from the pieces that remain. Whole, Briony and I will never have the uncomplicated closeness we shared when she was small. But we might have something better, a relationship built on choice rather than obligation, on mutual respect rather than assumed understanding, though. Woman who rented the West Wing 6 months ago was desperate to prove her worth as a mother. The woman writing this has learned that worth doesn't require proof, love doesn't require permission. Family doesn't require proximity. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is show up for your own life. Create your own celebration. Insist on your own joy even when others can't see it or share it. I showed up for Briony's wedding in the only way she allowed, and it turned out to be exactly what we both needed. Not a confrontation or a reconciliation, but a demonstration. A way of saying that love endures. That mothers don't disappear just because daughters need distance. That family can exist in multiple forms simultaneously. Tomorrow I'm going to look at houses with my daughter and her husband. Not because she owes me involvement in her life, but because she wants my perspective and values my opinion. It's a small thing that represents everything I thought I'd lost and discovered I'd never really lost at all. Love, it turns out, is much more resilient than I gave it credit for, much more creative in finding ways to express itself, much more patient with the messiness of human relationships and the time it takes for people to find their way back to each other. The painting is finished. The story continues. I closed the journal and looked out at the bay, where winter light was turning the water silver and gold. Somewhere across town, Briony was probably showing Marcus listings and discussing mortgage rates and imagining their life in a house they hadn't seen yet. In a few days, I would help them envision possibilities, offer opinions, be present for another chapter in their story without trying to write it for them. It was, I thought, exactly the kind of mother I wanted to be, available without being overwhelming, loving without being demanding, present without being intrusive. The kind of mother who could host dinner parties 50 yards from weddings she wasn't invited to and somehow, in the process, find her way back to her daughter's heart. Though, cottage felt full of possibility as I made my way to the kitchen to start planning Saturday's house hunting lunch. I had recipes to consider, opinions to prepare, and love to express in all the small, daily ways that actually mattered. I was no longer the mother who wasn't invited to her daughter's wedding. I was the mother who had learned to create her own celebration, and in doing so, had reminded her daughter that love was always worth celebrating, no matter how complicated the circumstances. It was, I realized, exactly who I'd always been meant to be. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.